was on a beautiful, chilly October morning, southern Missouri, on the old Carpenter Bend farm, that a mother and father hitched a team to their wagon and went out to gather a load of corn. Now, I might say that there are a few in our audience here that heard me tell this story a little over 3 years ago at a Vesper service, but I want to repeat it this morning, and particularly for the boys and girls. That father and mother had 2 sons, one aged 4 and one 5 at that time. They were working as a team, a mare called Nellie and a little mule called Sugar. They lived on a farm that encompassed about 750 acres that lay in a large bend of Black River. A man by the name of Carpenter had owned that farm years before, and it had become known as Carpenter's Bend because of the bend in Black River. There was lots of water on that farm. There was a little lake on one part that covered an acre or two, a lake that was a little over 40 feet deep. On the eastern side of that farm, the eastern area, ran a little creek called Indian Creek. To the west of it, on the neighbor's farm, just about a few hundred feet west of their line, was another little creek called Hickory Creek. That day, as that father and mother went to gather a load of corn, they were gathering corn in a 30-acre field that lay just south of the lake. They had all the fields named on that farm. There was the old hayloader field and the 30-acre field, and on we could go. But this particular field was called the South of the Lake field. And they were going to gather a load of corn in that field. They gathered corn by hand, the wagon, the horses, and they would straddle with the team and the wagon one row of corn. They called it the down row. And then they would gather 2 rows on either side of the wagon. Thus, as they moved through the field, they gathered 5 rows of corn. The 2 boys that day, being too young to really do a great deal, helped some with the down row. They would help mother on her side and father on his side. They had an interesting time that day as they moved through the field gathering corn. As they got toward the south end of the field, one of those boys noticed a few rows over a watermelon, a volunteer plant that some way or another had come up in the corn row and had grown there, and a little melon had developed. And of course, you recognize as well as I that when boys that have been roaming out in the cool October breeze for a few hours in the cornfield see a watermelon, they'd want to cut it, wouldn't they? You like watermelon? Sure you do. And so Father brought the melon over and he laid it in the back of the wagon. He took his jackknife out and he stuck it into that watermelon, but it was as tough as a rubber ball. You know, occasionally in growing melons, you have a hybrid or a freak, and they're called citrons. They're no good as watermelons. They're tough. You can actually bounce them on the cement before they'll break. And this melon was a citron. It was no good. Father finally got it cut open, but those boys were so disappointed because they had their taste buds all set for watermelon. But there was no watermelon to be had. But you know, Father and Mother that year had grown a 10-acre field of watermelons at the end of the South of the Lake field, a little bit to the west, and across the slough into what was known as the watermelon field. And even though it was in October and the melon season was past, those boys knew that there were still some watermelons there. And they began asking Mother and Father to let them go for a melon. Do you know how persistent boys and girls can be? Do you boys and girls know? I want to go. Why won't you let me go? Why? And so finally, with great persistence, Father and Mother said, all right, you can go to the watermelon patch and find a couple of melons and bring them back to the wagon. And so 2 little boys very happily went down the corn row to the end of the field, up along the slough to where the wagon trail went across into the watermelon patch, and they started looking for watermelons. The smaller of the 2 soon found a little melon that just fit his fancy. And he decided he would take that little melon and go back to the wagon. But the older, the big brother, had to look for a big melon. And he stayed longer, and he searched around the edge of the fields, out into the weeds where the vines had grown out. And after some searching and looking, he finally found a nice large watermelon. And then he started also back toward the wagon. When the older brother reached the wagon, the first question that Mother and Father asked him was, "Where's your brother?" And he explained that as soon as they went into the melon patch, he found a little melon that suited him, that he was happy with, and that he came back a long time ago, and that he had looked and searched and looked at this great melon he had found. But Mother and Father were not near as interested in the big melon as to where their little boy was. Well, he had started back to the wagon, assuming that in that 30-acre cornfield he had taken the wrong row going north toward the lake and missed the wagon. Mother and Father ran up and down through that field, and they called and shouted. But the only answer they received in return was the rustling of the dry corn leaves. Father returned back to the wagon, and he unhitched the team. He drove them to the end of the field and unhitched, and he got on old Nellie's back. And he started riding back and forth through that cornfield, even at times standing up so he could see many rows out over the field. And he looked and he called. The mother ran along the slough back into the watermelon patch. And they searched for about a half hour looking for their boy, until finally fear gripped their hearts and they realized their son was lost. As they met back at the wagon, they prayed there by the wagon wheel that the great God of heaven would watch over their son. They had no idea which direction he had gone. They searched frantically for a little while more, Father looking in the cornfield, just knowing that his boy had to be somewhere in that 30-acre cornfield. And the mother searching and calling and running and looking. They looked up at the sun. And by this time, it was beginning to go toward the western horizon. 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, in October in southern Missouri, the days get short like they do here, and the nights get cold. And they wondered where their little boy was. And they had a little council together. And Father said, "He's lost. And you're going to have to go for help, Mother. You're going to have to notify the neighbors and tell everyone to come and help us look." That mother said, "I don't want to leave. We've got to look." But Father said, "You must go." And so she took her older son by the hand and started for the nearest neighbor, which was about 1.5 miles away. And Father again on old Nellie's back started searching the field, the south of the lake, the long sand fields, back into the melon patch, along the sloughs, looking and searching. The mother, hurriedly, as fast as she could, went to the nearest neighbor, which was 2 brothers that lived together, and they just happened to be home. One said, "I'll take your son so you can go back and look, and I'll go to town and notify the sheriff." It was early enough in the afternoon that on the front page of their local newspaper, a little article appeared that said, "Small boy lost on Carpenter Bend Farm." As the newspaper went out over the town that evening, many of the church people and friends read that, and they started pouring to Carpenter Bend to look for that lost boy. The grandparents were notified. One of the uncles who had a hound who thought perhaps would trace and track the boy went to the scene. Within a couple or 3 hours, there were many, many people searching on that old farm. One of the grandparents had been stationed at the lake to direct new searchers so that they would have people going in all directions, because they didn't know which way he had gone. They couldn't even find tracks in the sand. A CCC camp was notified that was about 150 miles away, and 2 truckloads of men left there with lanterns, thinking that it might turn into an all-night search. They were coming to help. But while all of this activity was going on, there was a father on that farm riding old Nellie. He felt that he'd covered every inch of that farm. He even took the road and rode into the barn, the house, thinking that maybe his boy had followed the road home. While there, he put the saddle on to make riding a little more comfortable. But he couldn't even find a track in the sand. Returning back to the fields, he rode those fields. He went through the cornfields. He went down along the river, Black River, with many places, banks that were 20 feet straight up and down, with water 10, 15, 20 feet deep at the bottom. Fear gripped his heart as he looked at some of those places again. Could have his little boy tumbled over that bank into Black River? Could he have gone north and gone into the lake? Could he have gone east into Indian Creek? Where did he go? All the time praying that God would care for him and protect him. Just as the sun was sinking in the western sky, Father was riding old Nellie again down along the long sand field, a field that lay east and west, right along Black River. And at the end of that field was a small wooded area, an acre or so, a point that ran down where Indian Creek ran into Black River, an area that had grown up in switch cane and brush. And as he came to that point this time, old Nellie wanted to go out in that way, and he tried to steer her around. But she seemed to be determined. And so finally that father said that he dropped the reins, and he took hold of the saddle horn, and he breathed a prayer, and he said, "Dear God, lead Nellie to my lost boy." And he said with that prayer, old Nellie took a swift canter down through that switch cane, and it was hitting him in the face. And she stopped dead still, and he almost lost his balance and fell off. A group of mallard ducks had flown up from the creek, startled her and scared her, he thought. And as he was watching the ducks fly and thinking about how he almost fell off, old Nellie turned, and she walked about 50 feet out into the switch cane. And she stopped. And there it was that Father saw his little son sitting there pulling the leaves off of the switch cane. Tear stains in his eyes, down his cheeks. He jumped off and he grabbed that little boy. And while he was there on his knees hugging him, he thanked the great God of heaven again. And then he set him up on the saddle with him, and he started that 3/4 of a mile ride back across the field toward the lake, where the grandparents were stationed. And as he rode across that field at full speed, he shouted, "I found him, I found him." And within just seconds, that whole river bottom echoed with those beautiful words, "He's found, he's found, he's found." That father says he never expects to hear sweeter music until Jesus returns in the clouds of heaven to gather together his people. Then those words, "He's found, he's found." That night, as a father and mother tucked two little boys into bed, they again knelt and committed them and their lives to God, and thanked God for their protection of that day. Now, you know, to many this story may seem a little remote, maybe even a little far-fetched. But to me and to my family, that story is very, very real. You see, it was my father that rode old Nellie that day. It was my mother that took me, the older son, by the hand and led me to the nearest neighbor about 1.5 miles away. It was my brother who was lost and was found. I don't remember many of the actual happenings of that day, except really in my mind 2 things. I remember my mother's prayer, "Oh God, help me find Ray." And I remember going with the neighbor into the sheriff's office. I don't remember about going to town or any of that, but I remember going into the sheriff's office and seeing the sheriffs there with their guns. That's really about all I really remember. But I'll never forget my mother's prayer. Help me find my lost boy. My friends, God is a real God, and a God that desires to help us. And you know, at this Thanksgiving season, I think we should be thankful for the great God of heaven who hears and answers our prayer.